When he addresses the media today at the NFL Scouting Combine, Jets head coach Aaron Glenn needs to be clear about what's going to change in year two. Locked On Jets starts now.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It is Tuesday, February 24th, 2026, and I'm your host, John B. from GangGreenNation.com. Thanking you so much for making the show your first listen or first watch every day, and for making Locked On the #1 sports podcast network. A big shout out to you everydayers. If you're new to the show, this is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. On today's show, we're going to take a look at the top 15 players about to hit free agency and discuss which of those options the Jets should pursue. We'll talk about a potential new option who could be emerging at the quarterback position. The rumor mill is swirling that the team is ready to move on from a young quarterback. But we'll begin by talking about the NFL Scouting Combine. And unlike yesterday, we're not focused on any of the prospects today. One of the big events at the NFL Scouting Combine is most teams' head coaches and general managers address the media. It's a rare opportunity to hear from decision makers as we approach the offseason. Jets head coach Aaron Glenn and general manager Darren Muji are both slated to speak to the media. That should happen around 1 p.m. Eastern. And I think from these two, and particularly Glenn, there are things that I want to hear. Now, I'm a big believer that most interactions between a head coach and the press are theater. And you're not going to get a ton of details about the Jets' offseason plans from Glenn or Muji today. In fact, I sometimes wonder whether it even makes sense to have the coach and GM speak to the media before the start of free agency or before the draft. Typically, teams schedule press conferences before the offseason begins, and no team's going to give away its plan, at least in detail. You're not going to get a whole lot, and you don't want the other teams in the league to know what you're going to do. So you get a lot of cliches, you get a lot of boilerplate talk. You know, they'll be asked about Breece Hall, and they'll say something like, well, we want to bring Breece back at the right price. Hopefully we'll be able to work something out. Non-committal. Not that we're definitely signing Breece, not that we're definitely letting Breece go. You'll get something that suggests he could stay or he couldn't stay. And that's the way it is across the board. And occasionally you'll get an interesting nugget that kind of gives you some insight into how they want to build the team or what they want to prioritize. You know, sometimes you'll hear a GM talk about how the good teams in this league find a player at X position and are able to develop players at X position by using 4th, 5th, 6th round picks. And that's an interesting point because that tells you how a team may approach the draft. You know, there might be a GM who tells you, you know, our focus is on developing the quarterback position. So we're going to be very aggressive drafting quarterbacks. We're going to try and pick one every year. That's the Ron Wolf method. Ron Wolf is a Hall of Fame executive who worked for many teams, including a brief stint with the Jets. His view was that you should draft a quarterback every year. If a GM out there talks about the Ron Wolf method, then you can bet that team has a good chance of drafting a quarterback even in the late rounds that year. You may hear a GM from time to time talk about how good teams are able to find guard prospects and develop them in the middle rounds. Then you can get a sense that that team may look for a guard prospect in the middle rounds. Things like that don't specifically give away your strategy, but offer a little bit of insight. Occasionally, you get one of those. Most of the stuff you hear is not going to be very informative. But I think in this case, there are specifics Aaron Glenn can go into. And I think that the way the coaching staff was handled in the early stages of this offseason opened a lot of questions. And some of the questions have to be whether Glenn has a firm grasp on what he wants to do, on the sort of team he wants to build. It's not uncommon for a first-year coach to make changes after that first season, heading into year two. In fact, it's common to see some sort of turnover because every first-time coach kind of has a plan going in, but sometimes the reality doesn't line up with the plan that you made. Sometimes you see something didn't work and you want to change your approach. It's very odd, though. It's very unusual to see a coach make changes as radical as Glenn made over the course of this offseason. You know, they didn't just change a coach here or there. They didn't just change one coordinator. They got rid of both coordinators. They got rid of their passing game coordinator. They got rid of key position coaches like the quarterback's coach, the defensive line coach. And you could argue that all of those coaches needed to go. You could argue that the Jets needed to upgrade in all of those spots. But it's not a good look for Aaron Glenn, because making those changes suggests that he made a lot of bad hires for key positions in his first year. And you could make the argument, well, it's better to move on from mistakes than to continue with them than to double down on mistakes. But you also want to avoid making massive errors over and over, because the question needs to be asked: if Aaron Glenn couldn't get these hires right the first time, what are the chances he's going to be able to get them all right the second time? But beyond that, you saw some pretty massive philosophical shifts, particularly when we talked about the people running the offense and the defense. Jets, again, moved on from both coordinators. Steve Wilks was fired in season, and Tanner Engstrand was let go a few weeks after the season. There was also along the way, clearly some sort of philosophical shift, because all indications were that Glenn was in the early stages of this process, that Glenn was looking for someone he could kind of entrust the defense to. The name that kept coming up was Wink Martindale. And whether or not you like Wink Martindale or you don't like Wink Martindale, he was a big name. He was a guy who would have total autonomy over a defense, because you're not going to bring a guy like that in. You're not going to hire him. He's not going to take the job unless he has total control of the defense. And then something happened. The reports are that Wink Martindale was in the facility and Glenn said, no, I'm calling the plays. And that doesn't make a lot of sense, because I think anybody who knows the first thing about a coach like Wink Martindale understands that there was never a chance he was going to take a defensive coordinator job unless he was given full autonomy to call the plays. The Jets instead went with Brian Duker. Aaron Glenn decided that he wanted to take a bigger role in the defense. That was a change from the way the Jets started out their search for a defensive coordinator, because again, they were looking for Wink Martindale or a coach like that where Glenn could hand over autonomy on the defense. But beyond that, this kind of cuts against everything Glenn had talked about up to that point. Glenn had talked about wanting to kind of oversee the entire team, that he didn't want to be overly hands-on on the defensive side of the ball. So I think he needs to articulate what changed, because there are rumblings, and it's not hard to envision this happening. There are rumblings that Woody Johnson got involved, and that Woody Johnson essentially told Glenn, you're running the defense. And I think it goes without saying that whenever Woody Johnson's involved with a major decision, odds are it's not going to be a very good decision. Odds are it's not going to help things. Woody Johnson's the kind of guy who takes bad situations and makes them worse. So Glenn's got to articulate, if this was his idea, what exactly changed along the way? There's nothing wrong with changing your mind. Sometimes as a head coach, you decide, you know what, I don't want to be overly hands-on on this side of the ball. And then you get through the first year and you say, you know what, maybe I do need to take a bigger role on this side of the ball. That's my special. That's fine. But Glenn's got to articulate some reasons as to why this happened. And on the offensive side of the ball, he's got to talk about what Frank Reich's going to bring to the table. I'd also be interested to hear why the Jets delayed in making so many of these moves. It took them a couple of weeks to fire some of their position coaches. It took them around 3 weeks to get rid of Tanner Engstrand. It sounded like a lot of these guys were coming back. So I'd like to hear something about the process, some sort of explanation as to why everything took so long, because the Jets put themselves behind in their searches for replacements. And some of the hires they made were good, like Carl Dunbar. I'm a big Carl Dunbar fan. I should just talk about Carl Dunbar on this show, because hiring him as the defensive line coach is one of the few moves the Jets have made in recent years that I'm unequivocally happy about, that I don't need to talk myself into, that I don't need to say, well, this is the path it could go on if it goes well. This is the path I could go on if it goes poorly. Carl Dunbar was a great hire. A lot of the other hires, we don't really know, but the process behind these changes, I think, has opened up a lot of questions. And, I'm not expecting Aaron Glenn to tell us which free agents he's going to target. I'm not expecting Aaron Glenn to definitively tell us that, they're going to keep Breece Hall. Now, it's also possible. I mean, it is possible that they just say we're using the franchise tag on Breece. It's possible that, they talk about their decision for the 5th-year option on Will McDonald, that they're not giving away anything if those are the plans. But beyond anything, I think that there needs to be a clear explanation in order to build some confidence in Aaron Glenn going forward, because the way he handled the coaching staff was anything but confidence inspiring. Now, head here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll talk about the quarterback position. There are lots of options for the Jets this offseason at quarterback. Unfortunately, none of them are particularly enticing. There could be, however, a young quarterback about to hit the market. There are trade rumors about Michael Penix Jr. and the Atlanta Falcons. Jets are being speculated as a possible fit. I don't think they're a great fit, though. I'll explain why continuing here on this Tuesday edition of Locked On Jets. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by Home Chef. As the new year gets going, a lot of people are trying to simplify their routines, and dinner's a big one. Between busy workdays, cold winter nights, and packed schedules, having an easy, reliable dinner plan makes a huge difference. That's where Home Chef comes in. Home Chef takes the stress out of cooking by delivering fresh, pre-portioned ingredients right to your door with easy-to-follow recipes that actually taste great. They're rated #1 by users of other meal kits for quality, convenience, value, taste, and recipe ease. And it's easy to see why. Meals come ready to fit your schedule, 30-minute recipes, oven-ready trays, or quick lunches, with over 30 weekly options, including family-size meals and different dietary choices. Recipes are simple but feel elevated, even restaurant quality, with dishes co-created by chefs like Gordon Ramsay. And everything arrives pre-portioned, so there's less prep, less mess, and no wasted food. For a limited time, Home Chef is offering my listeners 50% off your first box, free shipping, and free dessert for life. Just go to homechef.com/lockedon. That's homechef.com/lockedon for 50% off your first box, free shipping, and free dessert for life. Must be an active subscriber to receive free dessert. Thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listen or first watch every day, and for making Locked On the #1 sports podcast network. A big shout out to you everydayers. If you're new to the show, this is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. The offseason does not exist for the everydayer club. Join the group chat now to talk Jets year-round and get every episode of this show ad-free. Head to LockedOnNYJets.supercast.com or hit the link in the show notes to learn more. Well, the Jets need to figure out the quarterback position this offseason, and there are not a lot of good options for them. The Jets very well might end up completely overhauling their quarterback room. It seems very unlikely Justin Fields will return for 2026, and he should not return. Tyrod Taylor, there's a better chance that he could come back, but he's at the end of his career and he can't stay on the field. I wouldn't mind, in theory, Tyrod Taylor returning as a backup because I think he's a backup level quarterback, but you got to trust that a guy is going to be available. I don't think you can trust that Tyrod's going to be ready to play if you need to call upon him. And then there's Brady Cook, who the best thing going for him is youth, but beyond youth, you need someone with upside. And I don't think Brady Cook showed any upside as the starting quarterback for the Jets late last season. Tough spot, but there were really no flashes. If the players got ability, you would expect there at least to be some moments where that shined through, and it did not for Brady Cook. Unfortunately for the Jets, there really aren't a lot of good options available. The options range between the unproven, like Malik Willis, to the underwhelming, like Jacoby Brissett, to the disappointing, like Kyler Murray, to the aging, like Kirk Cousins. Or they could also look to the draft, but they're not really in a position to take Fernando Mendoza, who would be the clear-cut #1 quarterback. So you'd be settling for someone like Ty Simpson, who could have upside, but not really clear the Jets would be the team that could get the most out of him. Well, NFL insider Jason La Canfora has dropped an interesting note that the Atlanta Falcons might be interested in moving on from Michael Penix Jr., who was their first-round pick 2 years ago. And that was a lot of controversy. If you may remember, the Falcons gave Kirk Cousins a pretty decent contract in free agency. The assumption was that Cousins was their starter going forward, and then out of nowhere, they drafted Penix in the first round. La Canfora throwing together some speculation. One thing you got to be careful about this time of year is there are lots of rumors out there, and some rumors have more substance than others. For example, last week, one of the big talking points on the internet was that Mac Jones may be available for the 49ers, that the 49ers might make him available for a trade. And I looked into that because I was interested why there was so much chatter on Mac Jones, and I traced it back to an article written in The Athletic by a 49ers writer, and the title of it was 49ers say they'll keep Mac Jones, but stars could be aligning for a trade. So essentially a headline that says the stars could be aligning for a trade. It's total speculation, had people talking as though Mac Jones was definitively an option. And if you read what Jason La Canfora wrote, I don't think it's particularly convincing. I mean, there's some insider reporting that the Falcons weren't thrilled with Penix last year. There's speculation from another team that needs a quarterback saying we're going to be competing against Atlanta. We're assuming that Atlanta is going to be in the market for a starting quarterback. But there's nothing definitive that says Atlanta is moving on from Penix. That said, I think that any viable quarterback option is going to be looked at by the Jets this offseason because there are no obvious choices in front of them. So let's talk about Michael Penix Jr. Now, I was intrigued by Michael Penix Jr. when he came out 2 years ago. And part of the reason that I was intrigued is he had a lot of starting experience in college. I think that starting experience does matter. We talked about this from the other end with Dante Moore. And it's just kind of common sense to me. The more you play, the more comfortable you get with reading coverages. The more types of coverages you see, the more you understand route combinations. It's just really one of those things that it's logical, that to me at least. And while a lot of the metrics around quarterbacks are changing historically, one of the biggest factors that correlates with success in the NFL to college play is just number of games started. You get more experience. It's, we always talk about this on this show, how there's no minor league for the NFL, and there really ought to be. There really ought to be a developmental league where players can go get game reps at full speed without a lot of pressure on them. The problem with the current NFL is that to get game reps, you have to go in an actual regular season game where you will be under the microscope, where if you lose, fans will blame you. And it's very easy for a young quarterback to lose all his confidence because fans get on him. If things don't go well, the team starts losing. He loses the confidence of the locker room. There should be a better, lower pressure way for guys to get game reps. But until that happens, all we really got is college football. And I like that Penix had a lot of starting experience in the college game. So does that mean the Jets might be interested in Penix? I got to be honest with you. If Atlanta makes him available, I would be very, very hesitant. And it's not so much about Penix. I think sometimes we need to think about why a guy's available. Now, if Atlanta is willing to make Penix available after 2 years, it would make me a little hesitant. The same way if somebody came up, the same way somebody coming to me with like a 2-year-old car, offering me like an unbelievable deal. There's a difference between a bargain and a price that's so low that makes you wonder what's going on here. At some point, you wonder why you could get a deal like that. And I think the same question would be why Atlanta would be ready to move on from a quarterback they just drafted 2 years ago. Now, the Falcons did shake up their organization, new GM, new director of football operations, new head coach. But a young quarterback you believe in that situation is a selling point for a job. Like last year when the Patriots had Drake May, that was a selling point. That was the thing that made it more likely to get a coach like Mike Vrabel. Now, obviously, Vrabel's ties to the Patriots organization had a lot to do with him eventually taking the job. But a young quarterback should be an asset. If the new regime comes in and immediately is willing to move off the young quarterback, you got to wonder a little bit what's going on there. Now, of course, in the NFL, there are big egos. Sometimes a new regime comes in and wants their own guy. But you would think that if you already have a young quarterback in place, your first objective would be to get things going with that guy. At least give him a shot. Because even if it doesn't work out, you're not the people who drafted him. So you essentially have a free year to take a look at a young quarterback to see what he's capable of doing. And if they're just willing to move off Michael Penix Jr., to me, that's a warning sign. To me, that's a red flag because they have the opportunity to look at him. They'll have the opportunity to take a look at him during the offseason program. They also have some holdovers in their organization who are probably giving them intel on, what things have been like and what Penix's abilities are and what his potential is. And, even though 2 years ago I was intrigued by Michael Penix Jr., if Atlanta's willing to move off him so fast, to me, that's kind of a warning sign. I know the temptation is to say, oh, you can get a young quarterback for cheap, but usually that doesn't happen. Sometimes a deal is too good to be true. And even if your argument is, okay, it's not working out for Penix in Atlanta, but maybe the Jets can turn him around, I would question whether the Jets are the sort of organization that has the stability right now to execute that sort of turnaround. You need a strong leadership in your organization. You need quality coaching. You need a quality offensive infrastructure around a quarterback if you're going to turn him around after a difficult start to his career. I don't think the Jets have any of those things. I think this Jets situation is very unstable at the moment. And frankly, that's why I've had reservations about the Jets even drafting a quarterback. Back in the days when it looked like Dante Moore was an option, I'm not going to lie, I had some concerns about that because I think that there was a clear pathway where maybe that would go quite poorly for this team. Um, so I think that it's not a great fit. The other thing that concerns me is that, when you talk about a project player, usually it's a guy who's got great physical tools, but not a lot of experience. And to go back to Penix, I mean, this was a guy who entered the league about as seasoned as any quarterback prospect in history. And from that, I mean, just the game experience. So it's one thing for a guy like Dante Moore, who, only started 20 or so games in college, who doesn't have a lot of experience. But I do wonder how much runway Penix has because of all the games he started. It's kind of a double-edged sword starting a lot of games because it means that you should enter the NFL ready to hit the ground running. If you're not ready to hit the ground running, to me, that's kind of a warning sign. And I do wonder at that point how much more you can get out of a quarterback. If he's not ready to play now, how much more game experience does he need to get ready for the NFL? So to me, there would be a lot of red flags here. I know he's a big name. Anybody who was drafted 2 years ago is going to be a big name if he becomes available in a trade. But if Atlanta makes him available in a trade, I would have some pretty significant questions as to why and as to whether this is the sort of quarterback the Jets should pursue. Now, head to the Locked On Jets podcast. We'll talk about some players the Jets should pursue. There was an interesting piece recently on NFL.com that listed the top free agents in this year's class. And I think there are a number who would be logical fits for the Jets. We'll talk about who they are continuing here on this Tuesday edition of Locked On Jets. This episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by FanDuel. Have you ever wanted to experience the NBA Finals live and in person? Well, FanDuel is giving you the chance to turn that dream into a reality with their NBA sweepstakes. Here's how it works. Use your profit boost on any NBA future, and you'll automatically be entered for a shot to win an NBA Finals trip for two. That's right, flights, tickets, the whole experience. If you're already looking at the board and thinking about which team can make a deep run, this is the perfect time to lock it in. You got to love futures this time of year, whether it's picking a team to win the championship or grab a conference title. It adds that extra layer of excitement to every game down the stretch. And now not only can your pick cash, it could also send you to the finals. If you're like me, you're a little disappointed the Olympics are over. I was really into it, cheering on our athletes right up to the gold medal game where we beat Canada in overtime in hockey. Well, now it's time to get into the NBA, and FanDuel's the place to do it. Visit FanDuel.com to get started and use your profit boost on an NBA future and get entered for a chance to win a trip to the NBA Finals. Play your game with FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA. This is the Locked On Jets podcast here on this Tuesday. Free agency is fast approaching. We'll get there in 3 weeks. The Jets will be looking to upgrade their roster. Jets projected to have a top 5 amount of cap space entering free agency. Greg Rosenthal of NFL.com just put out an article yesterday breaking down the top free agents available in this year's class. And I think a number of them could be interesting to the Jets. Now, of course, franchise tag season is upon us, so some of these guys may go off the board. In fact, there are already reports that George Pickens, who is the number 2 free agent on Rosenthal's board, he's with the wide receiver with the Cowboys, he's going to be franchised, so he's not going to be an option. Interestingly, Rosenthal put Malik Willis as his number 1 free agent. Willis is the Packers' backup quarterback, came on for Jordan Love late this season, played a couple of games, and played very well. An excellent performance in a loss on a Saturday night in Chicago. The Packers lost that game, but Willis exceeded all expectations. A week later, he played a very strong game in a loss to the Baltimore Ravens. Willis was a project when he was drafted by the Tennessee Titans. It was an early round pick. Titans gave up on him very fast. He went to Green Bay. He got developed by Matt LaFleur, and at the very least, has turned into a quality backup. The fact he's listed as the number 1 free agent is a worrying sign for me, though, because Willis has always been, to me, the sort of guy where if you can get him on a moderate contract, he makes sense. He's worth taking a shot on. But I worry that some team's going to go out and give him a big offer, give him multi-year guarantees. And I think that's difficult to justify because while the Green Bay film looks good for Willis, there is not a lot of film on him. There are questions about, can he sustain his level of play for the long run? Can he keep it going consistently? And I think the other question is, how does he respond to a bad game? Because there are plenty of quarterbacks who play well, and then teams go to school on them. Teams look at the film, teams spot weaknesses. And once these teams are able to exploit these weaknesses, the quarterbacks really struggle going forward. So there's a lot that's unknown about Willis. I think at a certain price he makes sense, but that price is a moderate price. If he's going to get paid like the number one free agent in this year's class, and look, this is just Greg Rosenthal's opinion. Maybe teams view it differently, but I'd be hesitant. It's one thing to be in a good ecosystem in Green Bay with good coaching and succeed. It's another to come to a team that struggled and have to be the guy and have to be the difference maker. I'd be hesitant about Malik Willis. There are other players on Rosenthal's list, though, who I do find interesting. One of them is his number 4 guy, Tyler Linderbaum. This is a guy we've talked a bit about this offseason. Linderbaum, excellent center for the Baltimore Ravens, one of the top centers in the league. The center position is not as valuable as it used to be. It's not as valuable as it was in Nick Mangold's day or Kevin Mawai's day. The 3-4 defense is no more. You don't have nose tackles lining up directly across from the center. Back in the Mangold Mawai days, 3-4 defenses were rising across the league. And the 3-4 defense was built around like a 330-pound space eater in the middle of your line. And his job was to draw a double team. So if you had a center like Mawai or Mangold who could block those guys one-on-one and win, it was a big advantage for your offense, and it prevented the 3-4 defense from messing your offense up. That doesn't exist anymore. That said, Linderbaum is just an excellent center. And I think that there's one position group the Jets could build this offseason into a truly elite unit, and that's the offensive line, because you're actually starting with pieces on the offensive line. It's like the one spot on the field where the Jets actually have pieces to build around. I'd say right now the Jets offensive line is probably middle of the pack. They're about 1 to 2 players away from potentially being an elite unit, building around Armand Membu and Olu Fashanu and Joe Tippmann. Get another really good lineman or two. This could be a top flight unit. So Linderbaum's an interesting guy to me. I think that he's a guy the Jets should look to pursue. Alec Pierce was the number 5 guy on Rosenthal's list. I've talked about Pierce quite a bit over the last couple of months on this show. To me, he just checks all the boxes that I want in a free agent. I want a guy who's in his mid-20s. Pierce is 25. Because you want to pay a guy as he's entering his prime years. One of the problems with the Jets is too often they pay guys based on what they did in the past, and they pay them as they're exiting their prime years. I also want a guy who's on an upward trajectory, and that's what Pierce has been through his entire NFL career. He just passed the 1,000-yard mark this season. He also complements Garrett Wilson really well. He's a deep threat. Garrett Wilson's not a deep threat. Garrett Wilson does a lot. That's good, but he's not a deep threat. It sounds like the Colts are going to be aggressive in keeping Pierce. He may even get the franchise tag, so I'm not sure he's going to be an option, but I think if he hits the market, he's a guy the Jets should aggressively build on. And I think that he's the sort of guy where overpay makes sense. A targeted overpay makes sense in certain situations. Jets got to upgrade the receiver room. And for a team like the Jets, Pierce is more valuable than your typical team because the Jets just have such a need. And the Jets need to get a guy like Pierce in here. So I think you could justify paying over slot for him. Devin Lloyd's an interesting guy, linebacker coming off his strongest season, kind of a do-it-all linebacker. And if you're looking at an Aaron Glenn style defense, you're looking at what Aaron Glenn wants. He needs linebackers who can kind of do it all, linebackers who are jacks of all trades. And Devin Lloyd's even a pretty decent blitzer. So he'd be a guy who I think could generate some interest from the Jets. I think he'd be a logical fit again, a guy who's ascending, just coming off his best season. It's kind of a double-edged sword. Sometimes you worry about the guy who had the contract year breakout, but it could also be a sign that he's ascending. And I think that could be the case with Devin Lloyd. Interestingly, also, though, your number 13 free agent and number 14 free agent are both members of the Jets. They're Breece Hall and Elijah Vera Tucker. And I think at the right price, keeping AVT makes sense. I think AVT is the sort of guy where it's not really clear what the market is going to be for him. And I would not be surprised if the market for AVT was radically different depending on which team you're dealing with, because this is a guy who's been really good when he's been in the lineup, but he's also missed a ton of time because of injuries. But the injuries he suffered aren't necessarily the sorts of things that are projected to be chronic. When Mekhi Becton got injured back-to-back years of the same knee, you could see where that would impact his career going forward, where, 2 major injuries to the same knee were going to make it much more difficult for him to have a successful career at the tackle position. He had to move to guard to find any sort of success. And even then, the success was fleeting. He had a good year with Philadelphia in 2024, but a bad year with the Chargers in 2025. AVT's injuries aren't really the sorts of things that project to be issues long-term. So, even though there's been a lot of injuries, could some team be willing to pay him a lot, take a chance? Maybe. I think on a moderate deal, on a deal which is either cheap or short-term or based on playing time incentives, Well, AVT could be a guy who could plug your line. He could fill, he potentially could fill in a role. In an ideal world, I think you get him as a backup because if you, depending on in a short run, that'd be ideal. I don't know whether that's plausible because there's a shortage of quality offensive linemen in the league. My sense is that someone's going to roll the dice. Some offensive lineman needy team will roll the dice on AVT, but I think there's certainly a price where he makes sense for the Jets. And as for Breece, I mean, I just don't see how the Jets are in the business of losing above average players. You could say that running back's not a valuable position, and that's fine. It's less valuable than a lot of other spots, but Jets really don't have a lot of good players, and a team with a lot of cap space and not a lot of good players. I don't think they should be losing good players. I don't think they should be letting good players walk out of the building. We know what Breece is. We know what he's not. Is Breece ever going to be that top 3 caliber back? I'm not sure that the answer is yes, but he's an above average running back. He's a home run hitter, and that's a really valuable attribute. It's an attribute the Jets don't really have in other spots. So again, this is another guy who I think a targeted overpay would make sense for. And if they can't do that, if they can't get Breece to agree to a long-term deal, I think you look to bring him back on the franchise tag. I don't think that Breece is a guy you let go. That's one of the challenges for the Jets is that not only are they playing offense, they're playing defense in some spots. They got to bring some guys back here to prevent the team from downgrading. And that's kind of the challenge we're facing this offseason. But that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoyed the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you enjoyed the show and are listening on a podcast, or just give this a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube and enjoyed the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. Helps us out, helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Have a great Tuesday, everybody. We'll be back tomorrow to talk more Jets.